Even if you have studied the history of Native Americans, there is still much you do not know. Today I will reveal some of their secrets that not even all scientists are aware of. How did Native Americans stay warm without fire? Their methods will surely surprise you. Imagine the endless Great Plains frozen by frost. The wind, sharp as a blade, carries snow dust, and the temperature drops to levels that seem incompatible with life. In this icy world where modern man would not last a day without technology, Native Americans not only survived, but lived for centuries. They had no central heating, electric heaters, or down jackets made of membrane fabric. Often, even keeping a constant fire going was a luxury or a tactical mistake that gave away their location. Their main source of heat was what they carried within and on themselves. An amazing system of knowledge where the body, clothing, and shelter worked as a single mechanism. Watch this video to the end to learn how a fur cape became a personal home, why sleeping together was not a matter of comfort, but a survival strategy, and what architectural secrets a typical teepee held. What if I told you that everything you believed about surviving the winter is not true? Modern man thinks of heat as something that needs to be constantly produced, turning on the heater, throwing wood into the stove. Native Americans approached this issue with a completely different philosophy. They sought not to produce heat, but to conserve what they already had. The main source of heat, the only real stove in the icy steppe, was the human body. Their entire winter strategy was built around this simple truth. Every item of clothing, every detail of their dwellings, every aspect of their behavior was aimed at preventing the precious heat generated by the body from being wasted. It was not a battle against the cold, but rather a skillful dance with it. They did not try to turn winter into summer, but accepted its rules of the game. Instead of spending enormous resources on heating the surrounding space, they created several layers of microclimate around themselves, each warmer than the previous one. This approach required a deep understanding of the laws of physics, materials, and their own bodies. They knew that air was the best insulator, that wind was the main thief of heat, and that moisture was a deadly enemy. This knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, was more valuable than any fire. They perceived heat not as an individual resource, but as a collective asset. It was practically impossible to keep warm alone, so the survival of the entire community depended on how well people worked together. The warmth of one person became the warmth of the whole family. It was a system in which there were no unnecessary details. The position of the body during sleep, the way clothes were worn, even the choice of a place to camp. Everything was subordinated to a single goal. The goal was to preserve the fragile spark of life that glowed inside each person. This principle of maximum efficiency permeated their entire culture. They did not waste energy on anything. Not on movement, not on emotions, not on heating. Winter was a time of concentration, not expansion. Their success in survival was a triumph of intellect over the elements. They won not by force, but by knowledge and discipline. It was this thoughtful approach that allowed them to thrive where others saw only an icy desert. Unlike modern individualism, where everyone heats their own home, their system was based on community. How effective do you think such a collective approach to problem solving would be in today's society? I'm very interested to hear your point of view, so please write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how clothing could be warmer than a modern down jacket? The first and most important layer of protection from the cold was personal. It was clothing. But it wasn't just clothing as we understand it, but rather a flexible, multi-layered shelter that a person wore on themselves. American frontier settlers created a clothing system that surpassed many modern technologies in its effectiveness. Their winter wardrobe was a complex engineering design where each element performed several functions at once. This clothing did not just protect against the cold. It created a personal microclimate that allowed a person to work actively at temperatures of -40 degrees. The secret lay not in the thickness of the material, but in understanding the principles of heat exchange and using the natural properties of materials. The main material for winter clothing was carefully tanned wild animal skins mainly deer, elk, and bison. The process of transforming raw hides into finished clothing took several weeks of intensive work. First, the skin was cleaned of meat and fat residues with special bone scrapers. Then it was soaked in a solution of animal brain, which contained natural enzymes that softened the skin fibers. After that, the skin was stretched, smoked over smoldering coals, and kneaded repeatedly until it became as soft as fabric. The final product, known as buckskin, had amazing properties. It was stronger than linen, softer than cotton, and warmer than wool. Unlike modern synthetic materials, which create a greenhouse effect, tanned leather had a unique ability to regulate temperature. Microscopic pores in the leather allowed moisture from the body to evaporate outward, but did not allow cold air to enter. This prevented the accumulation of sweat, which could freeze and turn into an icy crust on the body. The Native Americans, from whom the settlers adopted many leather processing techniques, knew the secrets of creating a water-repellent coating from a mixture of fat and beeswax. Leather treated in this way repelled snow and rain while remaining breathable. The multi-layered clothing system worked on the principle of a thermos, creating several air chambers between the layers of fabric. The first layer was underwear made of soft deerskin, turned inside out with the fur on the inside. This fur created thousands of microscopic air pockets right next to the skin. The next layer was a long-sleeve shirt made of coarser leather that reached to the middle of the thigh. On top of this, they wore a vest made of beaver or rabbit skins, sewn with the fur on the inside. In the harshest frosts, they added another layer, a long cape made of bear or wolf skin. The cut of each item of clothing was the result of centuries of experience of survival in extreme conditions. Shirts were sewn with a special stand-up collar that could be raised to the ears, protecting the neck and lower part of the face. The sleeves were made 10 centimeters longer than the arms, so that they could be used as improvised mittens. The front of the shirt was shorter than the back, which allowed for freedom of movement when walking, but protected the lower back when bending over. All the edges of the garment were trimmed with fur, which served as an additional seal and prevented snow from getting inside. Protecting the feet required particular ingenuity, as it was through the feet that people lost the most heat. Winter moccasins were a complex construction of 4 or 5 layers. The outer layer was made of thick bison leather, with the wool facing outwards. This was followed by a layer of tanned deer skin, then a layer of dry moss or shredded cedar bark. The inner layer was made of soft rabbit skin with the fur on the inside. Dried grass was often placed between the layers and changed every day. This grass not only provided warmth, but also absorbed moisture, keeping the feet dry. Mittens were made using a special technique, using bear or wolf paws, where the fur was particularly thick. A lining of squirrel skins was sewn into the mittens, and the thumb was made separate for a better grip on objects. The mittens were attached to the sleeves with special leather loops so that they could be quickly removed when it was necessary to work with bare hands. A long cord made of raw hide connected both mittens across the neck, which ensured their safety even during a blizzard. Some hunters wore double mittens, thin leather gloves under fur mittens for shooting a gun. The technology of clothing manufacture included many tricks passed down from generation to generation. All seams were made in a special way. First, the edges were sewn together, then covered with a strip of leather and sewn again. This created a tight seal that did not let the wind through. The sewing thread was made from animal tendons, which swelled when wet and made the seam even tighter. Instead of buttons, a system of leather loops and bone fasteners was used, which could be fastened even when wearing thick mittens. Protective patterns were often embroidered on the chest and back with porcupine quills, which not only decorated the clothing, but also created an additional layer of protection from the wind. This clothing was the product of 1,000 years of evolution and represented the pinnacle of technology at the time. A full winter outfit weighed about 15 kilograms, but the weight distribution was so well thought out that a person could work in it all day long. The clothing did not restrict movement and allowed the wearer to perform any task, from chopping wood to horseback riding. With proper care, such an outfit would last 10 or 15 years, passing from father to son. It was not just clothing, but a portable life support system, the first and most important line of defense against the deadly cold. What do you think was the most important piece of clothing for survival in extreme cold? But clothing was only the first barrier. Are you ready to learn how the second most important layer of protection was created? A fur cape that was both a blanket and a home? I will reveal the best-kept secret, how one item could replace clothing, blankets, and even the walls of a house. If leather clothing was the first line of defense against the cold, then the main stronghold, the personal fortress of every warrior and hunter, was a bison cape, or binya. It was not just a piece of clothing, but an entire ecosystem for survival, a universal tool that served as clothing, bedding, and shelter. It was made from a single bison hide, taken from the animal in winter. Winter fur was the thickest and warmest. It consisted of two layers, a dense, felt-like undercoat that trapped air, and long, stiff guard hairs that protected against wind and snow. The tanning process was laborious, but the result was worth it. The inner side of the hide was carefully cleaned and kneaded until it became soft suede. It was often decorated with drawings depicting the owner's exploits. It was a kind of passport and chronicle of life. The cape was huge. It could completely cover an adult with their head. When moving, it was worn with the fur inside thrown over the shoulders. The soft suede side was on the outside, and the thick fur created a cocoon of warm, still air around the body. This cape was the perfect protection from the wind. A person could sit on the ground with their back to the wind and wrap themselves completely in it, creating a personal, windproof shelter. Snow rolled off the long guard hairs without melting and wetting the undercoat. At night, the binya turned into a luxurious sleeping place. It was spread out on an insulating bed of branches and grass, with one half serving as a mattress and the other as a warm blanket. Often, two people could sleep in one such cape, warming each other with their body heat. The versatility of this item was remarkable. During the day, it protected against the cold on the road, and during breaks, it served as a seat, insulating from the frozen ground. In the dwelling, it was used as a blanket or hung on the wall for additional insulation. Even in the teepee, where it was relatively warm, people often sat wrapped in their capes. This allowed them to maintain a comfortable body temperature without overheating the entire room. It was an example of the very philosophy of energy conservation. The binya was more than just a thing. It was a companion for life, passed down from generation to generation. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and the main guarantee of survival during the winter months. Losing such a cape in the cold was tantamount to a death sentence. This one item embodied all the key principles of Native American survival: versatility, use of the best natural materials, and creation of a personal microclimate. A bison cape was not just clothing, it was a portable home that was always with you. Guess what happened next when individual protection was no longer enough? When the wind picked up and the frost grew stronger, even the best clothing and fur capes needed support. This support came in the form of housing. The third line of defense against the cold, designed with no less ingenuity than clothing. Native American dwellings represented the pinnacle of engineering, honed over millennia of trial and error in the struggle against extreme weather conditions. Each type of dwelling was perfectly adapted to its climate and the tribe's way of life. These structures did not simply protect against the elements. They created complex thermoregulation systems using principles of physics that modern science only rediscovered in the 20th century. Settlers arriving from Europe often ridiculed the primitiveness of Native American dwellings until they encountered their first real winter. Then they quickly realized that their stone and wooden houses were inferior to taipies and longhouses in terms of energy efficiency. On the Great Plains, where winds could reach hurricane speeds and temperatures could drop to -50 degrees, the taipi served as a home, an architectural marvel of nomadic tribes. Its conical shape was the result of centuries of natural selection of structures. The angle of the walls was exactly 54 degrees, the optimal ratio for minimum wind resistance and maximum internal volume. Modern aerodynamic studies have confirmed that this shape creates a zone of low pressure on the leeward side, which literally sucks the teepee to the ground. The stronger the wind blew, the more stable the dwelling became. The frame of the teepee was assembled from 15 to 25 selected pine poles up to 8 meters long. These poles were harvested in the summer, choosing young trees that grew in close quarters and were therefore perfectly straight. They were dried for several months until the wood became light as a feather but strong as steel. Installing the frame was a real art. The poles were tied with a special knot at a height of 5 meters, creating a tripod. Then the remaining poles were laid in a strictly defined order, forming a spiral. This spiral structure distributed the load so evenly that the teepee could withstand wind gusts of up to 150 kilometers per hour. The covering of the teepee was an engineering masterpiece, sewn from 12 to 18 specially treated bison hides. The hides were not sewn randomly, but according to a complex pattern resembling a semicircle with cutouts. When this covering was wrapped around the frame, it formed a perfect cone without a single fold. The cover weighed up to 70 kilograms, but thanks to a system of wooden pins and leather loops, 2 women could install it in 15 minutes. The bottom edge of the cover was deliberately left 30 centimeters above the ground, creating a controlled gap for airflow. The revolutionary double wall system turned the teepee into something like a modern thermos. The inner lining, called a liner, was attached to poles at a height of 1.5 meters and descended to the ground, where it was weighed down with stones. An air channel 20 centimeters wide was formed between the outer covering and the liner. Cold air entered through a gap at the ground, rose through this channel, was heated by the internal heat, and exited through the smoke hole at the top. This convection worked like a natural air conditioner, warming the interior in winter and cooling it in summer. The longhouses of the Iroquois represented a completely different philosophy of thermal architecture, a collective fortress against the cold. These monumental structures reached 30 meters in length, 7 meters in width, and 5 meters in height. The frame was assembled from young, flexible trees, which were bent into arches and tied together to create a tunnel structure. Several layers of elm bark, each up to 5 centimeters thick, were laid over the frame. The bark was laid overlapping, like tiles, creating a completely waterproof covering. The interior layout of the longhouse was carefully thought out to maximize thermal efficiency. In the center were hearths, one for every 2 families living opposite each other. Smoke from the hearths rose to the ceiling and slowly moved toward the openings in the roof, giving off heat along the way. Along the walls were 2-tiered platforms 2 meters wide. The lower tier, half a meter above the ground, served as a workspace during the day and a sleeping area at night. The upper tier was used for storage and as additional sleeping space for children. The thermal mass of the longhouse functioned as a giant energy accumulator. The thick bark walls and earthen floor stored heat during the day and slowly released it at night. The presence of 30 to 40 people in one space created a constant heat source of about 4 kilowatts. The temperature inside the longhouse rarely dropped below 15 degrees, even in the most severe frosts. Moisture from people's breath and evaporation from cooking condensed on the cold walls and dripped down, creating an additional layer of ice that acted as insulation. Both types of dwellings demonstrated a deep understanding of the principles of thermodynamics by their creators. Teepee used convection and aerodynamics to create a comfortable microclimate in a mobile dwelling weighing less than 200 kilograms. The longhouse applied the principles of thermal mass and collective heating to create a stable temperature in a stationary structure. These designs took into account not only the laws of physics, but also the social organization of society. The teepee reflected the independence and mobility of the hunters of the plains, while the longhouse embodied the collectivism and sedentary lifestyle of the farmers of the East. Which of these types of dwellings do you think is more effective at retaining heat, the mobile and individual teepee, or the monumental and collective longhouse? But even the best walls do not provide warmth on their own. In the next chapter, we will reveal how Native Americans used the main source of heat available to everyone, their own bodies. The human body is an amazing biological machine that constantly produces heat as a result of metabolism. Native Americans intuitively understood the basic principles of how this machine works and did everything they could to make it work as efficiently as possible. Their survival depended on the proper operation of their own bodies. The main fuel for this internal furnace was food. Their winter diet was high in calories, rich in protein and fat. It consisted mainly of dried meat, pemmican, a mixture of ground meat, fat, and berries, and nut reserves, which provided the body with the energy it needed to produce heat. They understood the importance of hydration even in cold weather. Dehydration disrupts metabolism and reduces the body's ability to regulate temperature. Therefore, they consumed a lot of fluids, melting snow or ice to obtain water. One of the key points was controlling perspiration. They knew that sweating in the cold was a sure way to die. Therefore, they avoided intense physical activity that could cause overheating and moved at a steady pace, maintaining a constant but not excessive body temperature. Layered clothing allowed them to flexibly regulate heat exchange. If it got hot, they could remove a layer or loosen the ties to release excess heat. This prevented the lower layers of clothing from getting wet with sweat. The body itself has built-in mechanisms to protect against the cold. When the temperature drops, the blood vessels on the surface of the skin constrict, reducing blood flow to the extremities. This allows heat to be conserved for vital internal organs. They applied this principle, paying particular attention to protecting the torso, neck, and head. These are the parts of the body where the most heat is lost. A well-insulated torso allowed the body to feel safe, sending warm blood to the hands and feet. Psychological attitude also played a huge role. Panic and fear cause stress reactions that disrupt normal thermoregulation. Calmness and confidence in one's abilities, on the contrary, help the body to function optimally. They knew that shivering was not a sign of weakness, but a way for the body to warm up. It is an involuntary contraction of muscles that generates additional heat. However, they tried not to let it get to that point, as shivering consumes a lot of energy. Their entire winter life was governed by the laws of thermodynamics. They instinctively felt the balance between heat production and heat loss. It was the art of living in harmony with their bodies and their environment. What I am about to show you was the norm for survival, but today it seems unthinkable. One of the simplest and most effective ways to stay warm, requiring no technology, was the closeness of other people. In a community-oriented culture, sleeping together and simply being close to each other was not just a social norm, but an essential element of survival strategy. The physics of this phenomenon is simple. Every person radiates heat, and when people are close to each other, they exchange this heat, creating a common warm zone. In addition, a group of people has a smaller total surface area in contact with cold air than the sum of the areas of each individual. In the large long houses of the Iroquois, this principle worked on a macro scale. Dozens of people living under one roof significantly increased the temperature inside the room with their breath and body heat. It was a living, breathing, collective heater. Inside the teepee where one family lived, this principle was applied on a smaller scale, but no less effectively. At night, family members slept close to each other, covered with shared furs. This significantly reduced heat loss for each individual. Children and the elderly, who are more vulnerable to the cold, were always placed in the middle. They were surrounded on all sides by the bodies of younger and stronger family members. It was a living shield that protected the weakest. This practice was not considered unusual or a violation of personal space. The concept of personal space as we understand it today simply did not exist. The well-being of the group was the absolute priority, and everyone understood that their personal survival depended directly on the survival of their neighbor. Even during the day, during long winter gatherings, when men repaired utensils and women did needlework, people sat close to each other. This created an atmosphere of not only emotional, but also physical warmth. Communication and joint work helped to keep warm. This method required no energy expenditure other than that produced by the bodies themselves. It was the embodiment of the philosophy of efficiency and collectivism. Instead of fighting the cold alone, they combined their strengths, or rather, their warmth. To modern people accustomed to separate bedrooms and personal space, such an arrangement may seem strange. But for people whose lives depended on every degree of heat, it was the most natural and logical strategy. It strengthened not only physical health, but also social ties within the community. Could you adapt to this level of community for the sake of survival? But simply lying down on the cold ground was not enough. In the next chapter, we will learn how sleeping places were created that functioned as real heat traps, conserving every joule of precious energy. Even in the warmest dwelling, the ground remains cold. Direct contact with frozen soil is a sure way to quickly lose all body heat. Therefore, no less attention was paid to creating the right sleeping place than to sewing clothes or building a shelter. The basic principle was simple: create as thick an insulating layer as possible between the body and the ground. This layer had to consist of materials that trap air well, It is the still air in the layers that is the best heat insulator. The first layer was often a thick bed of spruce or pine branches. The branches were laid in several layers, creating a springy and airy cushion. The needles not only insulated well against the cold, but also repelled insects and gave off a pleasant aroma. Woven mats made of reeds or dry grass were spread over the branches. They leveled the surface and added another insulating layer. These mats were lightweight and could be easily rolled up and taken along when moving. The next layer was a thick skin, such as bear or bison, laid with the fur facing up. This layer served as the main mattress, soft and warm. The thick fur perfectly retained air, preventing the cold from rising from the ground. Only on this multi-layered structure did a person lie down, covering themselves with their bison cape or other furs. The result was a kind of sandwich, where the body was reliably protected from the cold, both from below and above. The heat radiated by the body was reflected by the upper furs and retained in the lower layers, creating a warm cocoon. In permanent dwellings, such as the longhouses of the Iroquois, sleeping places were often made on wooden platforms or bunks raised above the ground. This was an even more effective solution. The air gap under the bunks completely cut off contact with the cold ground. These platforms were also covered with several layers. First came mats, then skins and furs. Such a bed was not only warm, but also quite comfortable. When creating temporary shelters on the road, hunters used the same principles. They quickly built platforms from available materials, branches, grass, leaves. Even a thin layer of insulation was better than nothing. The art of creating a warm bed was one of the key survival skills. A person's ability to hunt and work during the day depended on how well they rested and recovered their strength at night. Quality sleep and warmth was the key to health and energy. This system once again demonstrates a deep understanding of the laws of nature. Native Americans did not have laboratories, but through trial and error, they came to the same conclusions as modern science. They knew that to retain heat, you need multi-layered insulation filled with air. Even when well-dressed, the human body loses heat much faster in the presence of wind. Wind blows away the thin layer of warm air that forms on the surface of the skin and clothing, constantly replacing it with cold air. This phenomenon, known as convective heat loss, is the main enemy in winter conditions. Native Americans understood this threat very well. Therefore, choosing a location for a winter camp was a strategically important decision. They never built their dwellings on open hilltops exposed to the winds or in the middle of a bare plain. The ideal place for a winter camp was a river valley protected from prevailing winds by high banks or hills. A dense forest or grove also served as an excellent natural windbreak. Trees significantly reduced wind speed, creating a calmer and warmer microclimate. When setting up a teepee, the entrance was always located on the leeward side, usually to the east. This prevented cold winds from blowing into the dwelling. In addition, this orientation allowed the first rays of the morning sun to shine into the house. If the camp had to be set up in a relatively open area, the teepees were placed close to each other. Arranged in a circle, they created a barrier, protecting the center of the camp from the wind. This common space was much warmer and calmer. Hunters caught in bad weather on the road knew how to quickly build temporary windbreaks. The simplest was to dig a depression in the snow at the foot of a tree or rock. Even a small pit significantly reduced the impact of the wind. A more substantial shelter was a wall made of snow blocks or branches and skins. Such a shelter, known as a quinze among northern peoples, was not a full-fledged dwelling, but it allowed them to wait out the storm, protecting themselves from the most dangerous factor, the wind. They carefully studied the landscape. Any fold in the terrain, ravine, or rocky outcrop could become a shelter. The ability to find or create such a shelter was as important as the ability to find food. Even their clothing was designed with wind protection in mind. Thick leather did not let the wind through, and hoods and high collars protected the face and neck. They understood that it was not enough to simply keep warm. They had to become impervious to the wind. The battle against the wind was constant. It was invisible, but it was the most insidious enemy, sucking away their body heat. Their entire strategy for positioning themselves in the terrain was subordinated to a single goal: to hide, take shelter, and avoid direct contact with the icy breath of the plains. Survival in extreme conditions is not only a physical battle, but also a psychological one. The mental attitude, cultural traditions, and lifestyle of Native Americans were as important for keeping warm as fur blankets and teepees. Their winter mind was tuned to conserving energy. The philosophy of survival among the indigenous peoples of North America was based on the fundamental understanding that humans cannot defeat nature, but can become part of it. This wisdom was formed over thousands of years and passed down through generations in the form of rituals, customs, and mental practices. The winter mindset began to take shape at the end of summer, when the tribe began psychological preparation for the cold season. Elders conducted special ceremonies to prepare people's minds for the coming trials. This mental adjustment was as important as gathering firewood or sewing warm clothes. Unlike modern society, which tries to ignore seasonal rhythms with the help of technology, Native Americans consciously synchronized their lives with natural cycles. Winter was perceived not as an enemy, but as a wise teacher who demanded respect and understanding. With the first snows, the tribe entered a special mode of existence that could be called controlled hibernation. Physical activity decreased by 70% compared to the summer period. The heart rate slowed down, breathing became deeper and less frequent, and the metabolism shifted to a mode of maximum energy conservation. The interior of the dwelling became the center of the tribe's universe for the long winter months. A special routine reigned here, where every action was thought out in terms of energy conservation. The men were engaged in making arrowheads, carving them out of flint with slow, precise movements. This work required concentration but not physical strength, allowing the body to remain at rest. Women processed hides using bone scrapers in a measured, almost meditative rhythm. Children learned to weave baskets or embroider with beads, developing fine motor skills without expending much energy. Oral tradition flourished in winter, turning long, dark evenings into universities of tribal wisdom. Storytellers occupied a special position in the tribal hierarchy, as their art allowed them to travel in their imagination while remaining physically immobile. Epic sagas about the origins of the world, the exploits of ancestors, and spiritual journeys could last several evenings in a row. The listeners sat in tight circles around the storyteller, their bodies touching, creating a common heat field. The narrator's rhythmic voice put the audience into a trance-like state, where time flowed differently and the cold receded into the background. The attitude toward cold as a natural element of life was formed from infancy through a system of gradual adaptation. Newborns were not wrapped in dozens of blankets, but were accustomed to the coolness from the first days of life. Children were taken out into the cold for short periods, gradually increasing the time of exposure. By the age of 5, a child could play in the snow in light clothing without discomfort. This practice caused physiological changes: an increase in brown fat, improved capillary blood circulation, and an increase in basal body temperature. An adult Native American generated 20% more heat than a European of the same build. The concept of comfort in Native American culture was radically different from modern ideas. The ideal temperature was considered to be around 12 to 15 degrees Celsius, warm enough not to shiver, but cool enough to stay alert. Overheating was considered dangerous, leading to a loss of alertness and energy. Sweating in winter was seen as disastrous, as wet clothing lost its insulating properties. Therefore, all activities were performed at a calm, measured pace, avoiding any sudden movements. Psychological resistance to cold was strengthened through a system of rituals and beliefs. Many tribes practiced morning dousing with ice water or rubbing with snow, which not only hardened the body, but also demonstrated the power of spirit over matter. Warriors underwent initiations that included spending the night in the snow wearing only a loincloth. Those who survived not only gained a new status, but also unshakable confidence in their ability to withstand the cold. This confidence in itself increased cold resistance through psychosomatic mechanisms. Economy of movement reached the level of high art, comparable to the Japanese tea ceremony. Every gesture was honed by generations to absolute efficiency. When getting up from a couch, a person used a minimum of muscles, rolling over and using inertia. When passing an object, people moved only their hand, keeping their elbows still. Even the manner of speech changed in winter. People spoke more quietly and slowly, saving energy for breathing. An experienced hunter could sit by a hole in the ice for 8 hours, making fewer movements during that time than a modern person makes in 5 minutes. The culture of energy conservation permeated even social interactions. Conflicts and disputes were postponed until spring, as emotional excitement burned precious calories. Laughter and boisterous displays of joy were rare. A state of calm contemplation prevailed. Sexual activity also followed seasonal rhythms, dropping to a minimum in winter. Even dreams, according to beliefs, became calmer and longer, allowing the spirit to rest while the body regained its strength. Thus, their main weapon against the cold was not fire, but discipline, patience, and a deep understanding of their place in the natural cycle. They did not fight winter. They became part of it in order to survive it. The Native American system of survival in winter conditions is a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability. Without advanced technology, they created a virtually perfect system of heat conservation based on a deep understanding of the laws of physics and biology. Their legacy is a set of principles that are still relevant today. The key principle was layering. This approach was applied to everything. Clothing, where several layers created air gaps, dwellings, where the inner tipi canopy formed an insulating layer, and sleeping areas, where a floor made of branches, mats, and skins blocked the cold from the ground. The second principle was the priority of heat conservation over heat production. They understood that it was much more effective to prevent an already heated body from cooling down than to try to warm it up again. Their entire strategy was aimed at minimizing heat loss. The third principle was the use of air as the main insulator. They intuitively knew that it was not the fur itself that provided warmth, but the air it trapped between the fibers. This same principle was the basis for the design of their dwellings and beds. The fourth and perhaps most important principle was the power of the collective. They used each other's warmth for mutual heating and shared shelter and resources. Survival was not an individual task, but a communal one. Many of these ideas are still used today. Modern tourist clothing is based on the same principle of layering. The best insulation for sleeping bags and jackets works by trapping as much air as possible. The concept of a passive house in modern architecture, which requires minimal heating due to perfect insulation, is essentially the technological embodiment of the tipi idea. The idea of conserving heat rather than endlessly producing it is becoming increasingly relevant in a world facing an energy crisis. The history of indigenous peoples' survival teaches us that the most effective solutions are often the simplest. It shows that a deep knowledge of the environment and materials can be more valuable than the most sophisticated technologies. This is a lesson in respect for the wisdom of our ancestors and for nature. They have proven that the human mind is the most powerful tool for survival. The ability to observe, analyze, and draw conclusions has allowed them to thrive in conditions that seem unbearable to us. Their experience is an invaluable asset to all of humanity. Their methods are not just a set of tricks, but a holistic system where each element is connected to the others. Clothing, shelter, food, social structure, and psychology all work toward a common goal: to survive the long, dark, and cold winter in order to welcome a new spring. We can see that the survival of Native Americans in winter without a constant fire was not a miracle, but the result of a complex and well-thought-out system of knowledge. It was a quiet, daily battle for every degree of warmth, in which their main weapons were not brute force, but intelligence, observation, and collectivism. From layered clothing to tipi architecture, from a high-calorie diet to communal sleeping, every element of this system had been refined over centuries. Their experience reminds us that there are other ways of interacting with nature, not conquest, but adaptation. It shows that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit and ingenuity can find ingenious and effective solutions, using only what is at hand. It is an eternal lesson in resilience and wisdom. What other aspects of the life and survival of the indigenous peoples of North America would you like to see in our next issues? Perhaps you are interested in their diet, hunting methods, or social structure? Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the mysteries of the past.